What happens when a family's name, once whispered in reverence, begins to echo instead as a curse? What silence descends when the walls of a household hold more screams than lullabies? And what if innocence itself is made into an experiment, a stage for cruelty disguised as science? Before we continue, make sure to subscribe so you never miss these haunting untold stories. The Morlok family lived in the quiet folds of mid-20th century America, a place where streets were lined with modest houses and children played beneath elm trees whose roots stretched deep into the soil. To the outside world, theirs was a household marked by an extraordinary event, one that newspapers would tout as a marvel of nature, even a scientific miracle. In 1930, in Denver, Colorado, the Morlok home became the site of something nearly unheard of, the birth of quadruplets. 4 identical girls, each a mirror of the other, their cries rising together like a chorus of fate. Their names were Norma, Naomi, Nola, and Neva, later known to history as the Genain Quadruplets. The press adored them. Reporters would crowd their doorstep, photographs flashing as the girls were lined up in matching dresses. Smiling yet stiff, they appeared as dolls, props to a story larger than themselves. The public saw 4 shining curiosities, but within the Morlok household, shadows pressed close. Their father, Carl Morlok, carried a sternness carved not by discipline, but by something darker. His face, often photographed as stoic, masked a volatility that would leave marks unseen by cameras. He was a man bound by superstition and burdened by paranoia, haunted by whispers of madness in his bloodline. He feared not the world, but the notion that his daughters carried within them a legacy of insanity, one he believed was inescapable. And so he fashioned himself both their keeper and their judge. The house itself reflected his dominion. Curtains were drawn heavy, as though daylight might expose secrets too delicate for strangers. Inside, silence was demanded. The girls learned to move quietly, their footsteps softened against creaking boards. To disobey was to summon his wrath. Their mother, weak and withdrawn, often lingered in the background, her eyes heavy with both sorrow and resignation. She too was a prisoner, not of chains but of submission. As the years passed, the Morlok daughters grew, yet they did not grow free. Their father imposed rules that bordered on ritual. He watched them carefully, searching for signs, an odd gesture, a misplaced laugh, a flicker of defiance, that might reveal the madness he so feared. He documented them in notebooks, lines filled with observations cold and clinical, as if his children were specimens in a jar. The daughters, in turn, learned the art of repression. They spoke little, their voices muted like candle flames threatened by wind. It was not long before outsiders took notice. In 1954, researchers and doctors descended upon the Morlok household. The Genain Quadruplets, once celebrated as a medical rarity, became subjects of study. Psychiatrists prodded them with questions, measured their responses, charted their lives. To the world of science, they were a phenomenon. To the Morloks, they were possessions being examined under brighter and harsher lights. And yet, beneath the clinical gaze, something more sinister stirred. For the sisters were not merely observed, they were exposed. Details of their most private torments would find their way into reports and publications. The family name, once noted with awe, now shimmered with unease, with whispers of hereditary insanity. The sisters bore not only the weight of their father's discipline, but the intrusion of strangers who saw in them not humanity, but a living experiment. Norma, the eldest, carried herself with a quiet dignity, though her heart ached with the burden of responsibility. Naomi, restless and sharp-eyed, rebelled in subtle ways, her silence edged with defiance. Nola, fragile in spirit, seemed to bend beneath the weight of expectation, her mind wavering like a candle in a draught. Neva, the youngest, bore both fear and sorrow, her wide eyes reflecting the walls that confined her. Together they lived as reflections, each different yet bound by the same fate. They were daughters, sisters, subjects, and prisoners all at once. Whispers began to slip through the town. Neighbors spoke of the Morloks with hushed unease. Children, once fascinated by the 4 identical girls, began to mock them, calling them strange, cursed, unnatural. The Morlok daughters withdrew further, their home becoming less a sanctuary and more a mausoleum where dreams withered in silence. But in silence, there is always something that grows unseen. In the corners of their minds, in the darkened rooms where they huddled together, the sisters began to feel a truth pressing against them. Their father was not merely a guardian, not merely a man afraid of inherited madness. He was the architect of their despair. The true sickness of the household did not flow through their veins, but through his shadow that stretched across every room. One night, as the wind hissed against the shutters and the house seemed to breathe with restless weight, Norma heard footsteps where there should have been none. A door creaked open, slow and deliberate. She sat up, listening. Across the room, Naomi stirred, her eyes wide in the dark. And then, faintly, came the sound of weeping, not from one of her sisters but from her mother's chamber. The sound was smothered quickly, replaced by silence heavy and suffocating. Norma lay awake, her hands clenched, knowing in her heart that their family story was shifting, that something long buried beneath obedience and fear was beginning to stir. The house seemed colder that night, the air heavier, the silence more dangerous. And in that silence, the seeds of suspicion were planted. For what happens when those who are studied, caged, and silenced begin to see the bars around them not as protection, but as a prison? The answer would come, not in whispers but in echoes that would stain history itself. The Morlok house in Denver carried itself like a mausoleum. From the street, it appeared ordinary, a modest home with trimmed hedges, lace curtains drawn against the light. But within it was a chamber of unease. The daughters had learned to live as shadows, their movements choreographed to avoid the sudden fury of their father. Yet even shadows cannot remain still forever. By the late 1950s, whispers began to circulate beyond the walls. Doctors who came to examine the Genain Quadruplets noted inconsistencies, not merely in the girls' behavior, but in the household itself. Why did the father refuse them normal schooling? Why were neighbors discouraged from visiting? Why did the daughters speak of punishment in tones so hushed, as if the very air might betray them? The Morlok patriarch presented himself to outsiders as a man of grim duty, a father guarding his daughters against inherited madness. But behind closed doors that guarding revealed itself as obsession. He dictated when they could eat, when they could sleep, even how they could speak. He catalogued their lives in journals thick with ink and paranoia. Every twitch, every moment of hesitation, was recorded as evidence. He did not see them as children growing into women. He saw them as fragile glass waiting to crack. The sisters, though identical in face, began to fracture inwardly. Norma, the eldest, took on the role of caretaker, holding her siblings together with quiet endurance. She obeyed outwardly, but in the depths of her gaze, rebellion smoldered like coal waiting for air. Naomi, sharp and restless, bristled under their father's control. She tested his patience with small acts of disobedience, lingering too long at the window, refusing to answer his questions, allowing silence to stretch where he demanded replies. Nola, sensitive and easily wounded, folded under the pressure. She withdrew, her mind curling in on itself, echoing with whispers no one else could hear. Neva, the youngest, trembled between fear and sorrow, watching her sisters suffer while feeling powerless to intervene. Yet something began to change. The sisters were not as isolated as their father wished. Doctors from the National Institute of Mental Health, eager to study what they deemed a rare case of genetic schizophrenia, pressed their way into the household. Researchers scribbled notes while the sisters sat under their gaze, for identical faces marked by unease. To the world they were a scientific treasure. To the sisters they were exhibits, placed under lights, stripped of dignity. But science has its own cruelty. Reports of the sisters' supposed abnormalities spread among professionals, painting them as curiosities of hereditary illness. Their names became whispers in corridors of hospitals and universities, tied not to who they were, but to what they represented. The sisters were not only bound by their father's discipline, they were imprisoned by a narrative that outsiders were eager to write for them. And yet, even in such captivity, rebellion brews. Naomi, ever restless, began to question aloud. "If they say we are mad," she whispered to Norma one night, "is it because of us, or because of him?" Norma hushed her, fearing their father might be listening. But the seed of suspicion had already been planted. The town, too, began to sense disquiet. Neighbors reported seeing the girls only rarely, always under their father's watchful eye. When one neighbor once waved to Naomi through the window, the girl's tentative smile was swiftly followed by the curtain snapping shut, as if an unseen hand had yanked it closed. Rumors trickled. Was the father hiding something? Was his obsession with madness a reflection of his own unraveling mind? One winter evening, a doctor returned from the Morlok home with a face pale and troubled. When pressed, he spoke carefully as though weighing each word. "The father," he said, "is too controlling. He documents every detail of their lives. I fear what I cannot see behind those walls." His colleagues dismissed it as overconcern, but the unease lingered. Inside the household, the atmosphere thickened. The sisters felt the weight of their father's watch more heavily with each passing day. Even the simplest act, folding laundry, setting the table, was accompanied by his gaze, a hawk circling above prey. Their mother, silent and withdrawn, no longer seemed capable of offering protection. She drifted through rooms like a ghost, her sorrow too heavy to carry, her will too broken to act. And then came the incident that shattered the stillness. It was Naomi who dared speak out first. One night, at supper, when her father corrected the way she held her spoon, she froze. Then, in a voice trembling but defiant, she said, "Perhaps it is not us who are sick. Perhaps it is you." The words fell into the silence like glass shattering on stone. The room froze. Her sister's eyes widened, their mother gasped softly, and their father's face hardened. He struck her across the cheek with the back of his hand, the sound sharp as a whip crack. Naomi fell silent, but the damage was done. A truth had been spoken, one that could not be unspoken. From that night forward, fear was no longer their only companion. Suspicion joined it. The sisters began to look at their father differently, not as the gatekeeper against madness but as its source. His rules no longer felt protective but suffocating. His journals no longer seemed scientific but grotesque. His presence no longer carried authority but terror. The house grew heavier with secrets. Shadows lengthened. Doors creaked when no one touched them. At night, footsteps were heard in halls where none should walk. The sisters whispered to one another, their voices faint but urgent. "We are not cursed," Neva whispered one night, clutching Norma's arm. "We are trapped." And deep within that house, beneath the weight of silence and sorrow, a thought began to take root, unformed, unspoken, yet pressing against them all the same. If the sickness was not theirs but his, what then must be done to escape it? The answer was coming, and when it came, it would be as irreversible as fire-consuming paper, leaving nothing but ash. By the early 1960s, the Morlok home was a cauldron of fear. Each day pressed the Genain sisters deeper into an existence of control, their father's gaze following them like a shadow stitched to their skin. But beneath that suffocating presence, rebellion had begun to stir like a creature restless in its cage. It began with small refusals. Naomi refused to answer when her father barked her name. Norma looked him in the eye instead of lowering her gaze. Neva, usually timid, began to whisper prayers not to God, but to freedom itself. And Nola, her mind already bent under the weight of his rules, began to laugh when he demanded silence, her laughter thin and sharp as broken glass. Their father felt it though he did not name it. His journals grew darker, his handwriting jagged. He wrote of contamination, of rebellion, of forces conspiring against him within his own household. He spoke less to his daughters and more to himself, muttering in the still hours of night, pacing through the halls as though warding off ghosts only he could see. The sisters endured, yet in their endurance, something hardened. They were no longer merely subjects of his experiment, they were witnesses to his unraveling. And witnesses, once awakened, cannot remain silent forever. The breaking point came one storm-laden night. The air was thick with the scent of rain, the windows rattled under the weight of wind, and thunder growled like some ancient beast outside. The sisters gathered in their shared room, their whispers weaving together like threads of a secret tapestry. "We cannot live like this," Naomi hissed, her cheek still bearing the faint scar of his hand. "He will destroy us all," Neva murmured, her hands trembling. Norma, steady even in fear, whispered, "Then we must stop him." It was not a plan in the way one writes a plan, it was a decision, fragile and terrifying. That night they did not sleep. Their father moved through the house, muttering, scratching at his journals. The lamp in his study cast long, skeletal shadows down the hall. The sisters waited until the hour stretched thin, until the house seemed to breathe as though alive. Then, like shadows themselves, they moved. No one knows precisely what happened that night. The records remain fragmented, obscured by rumor and silence. But one account whispered later suggested that the sisters entered the study as a unit, four faces alike, for shadows joined. Their father looked up, startled. His lips moved as if to scold, to command, but his words faltered when he saw their eyes. Not fear. Not obedience. Something else. The journals, stacked high, became kindling. A lantern overturned, flames licking up the pages that had bound their lives in ink and paranoia. Their father screamed, not in rage but in something closer to terror, as the fire devoured his words, his life's work, the very evidence of his control. The sisters did not speak. They stood in silence, watching as the fire grew. Some say they held him back when he tried to save the journals. Some say he fell, choking on smoke, clawing at the floor. Others claim he fled the house into the storm, never to be seen again, his shadow dissolved into the night. By dawn the house was a husk. The journals, the evidence of decades of obsession, were nothing but ash. The neighbors spoke of the fire in hushed tones, of the daughters' calm faces as they stood in the yard, flames reflecting in their identical eyes. The authorities came, but the story twisted quickly. The fire was ruled an accident, the journals dismissed as the ramblings of a man too stern, too strange. The daughters were sent into the care of doctors once more, their lives studied, dissected, and published. But the fire, the night they burned his dominion into smoke, remained their secret. And yet, secrets have a way of leaking into legend. Some say that in the ruins of that house, voices can still be heard, the whispers of 4 girls rising in unison, the crackle of burning paper, the rasp of a man's desperate cry. Others claim that on stormy nights, a figure can be seen pacing the streets near the old Morlok home. A man clutching charred journals, muttering to himself as though still trying to hold dominion over daughters who no longer listen. The sisters themselves became fractured in history, some institutionalized, some fading into obscurity, their names footnotes in psychiatric texts. But to those who look deeper, they are not footnotes at all. They are a legend, a haunting reminder of what happens when chains are bound not to wrists, but to the soul. What happens when control becomes obsession? What happens when silence becomes rebellion? The story of the Morlok family and the Genain Quadruplets lingers not as a medical case, but as a Gothic tragedy, half history, half ghost tale. And in the silence that follows, one cannot help but wonder, how many houses still hide stories like theirs, waiting for the fire to come? If this story chilled you, don't forget to like this video. It helps us bring more forgotten tales to light.